Hey everyone, hopefully you were able to get onto Canvas and looking through your syllabus and everything was clear. If it's not, by all means send me an email. I'll help you clear it up. Today we're going to try and move forward with the understanding we talked about last time. Move forward with the idea how important it is to document everything from the time that we show up at a crime uh, to get that case put together for the prosecutor all the way through the courts. It's extremely important, that documentation. We'll talk a bit about evidence, and we'll talk a little bit about the types of evidence that we actually see in the majority of crime scenes. So the one important factor moving forward is I always get asked by students, the career field that I'm choosing within criminal justice, police officer, detective, whether it's in the FBI, federal government, does it require a lot of writing? And the answer is yes, a lot of writing, a lot of documenting. So it's not a career field that if you have skills that need refreshing, get those. You need to be able to write your words out to where a prosecutor, to where everybody understands what's happening. So documenting, extremely important. Couple of points before we move forward. I would say, 25%, at least a quarter of your job in any crime scene and furthering it through the courts would be documenting, writing down your ideas. Remember, it's what you see in the crime scene. I don't want the opinions. We'll talk about what specifically is in those documents, but remember, keep the opinion out of it. Just write down and document the things that are necessary for people to understand moving forward. Your reputation is on the line from the day that you get out of the academy and walk onto the streets as a police officer, whether it's a special agent with the FBI. Every document, every piece of paper that you fill out, people will be looking at it with your name attached and making assumptions about how good you are at gathering those details within that crime scene. So remember, your reputation is extremely important based on what we see on paper. So let's just talk about a crime scene in general. When you approach a crime scene, you're going to be keeping field notes. Most of the time, you're going to be documenting, whether it's on a pad of some type, whether it's a 3x5, but you're going to be making brief sketches and field notes throughout the entire time you're walking through the crime scene. Keep those notes. They can be later asked for in a court setting. So we always keep everything, even if we're just writing down stuff, sketching things in what we call field notes. When you approach a crime scene, I want you to understand, unlike what you see on TV, you need to be safe. Be safe, have an understanding of things that have happened within that crime scene. Might not always be stable. Things could still be happening. Suspect could still be there. We could have everything from chemicals within a drug lab, all kinds of things. So when you approach the scene, number one, I want you to make sure, did I get help? Medical emergency help for everyone involved, whether that's the victim, the suspect, get help for everyone. How we document and everything that I'm going to talk about is secondary to taking care of people there at the scene. Take care of them. Second thing is, at that point, try and preserve that crime scene the best that you can. So be safe. Approach it. Keep Locard's principle of exchange in mind, that once you enter, you are going to contaminate in some way. You're going to affect that crime scene, and so will everybody else that walks into that crime scene. So be aware, be alert for witnesses. Many times as you're walking in, there will be people outside of that perimeter that crime scene that might have valuable information. So from the minute that you get there, before you even start to run into a crime scene, approach, and everyone out there that's watching, everyone, if you need to get help from other detectives, other police officers, then have them help you. But try and find anybody that might have information that can help you before they leave that crime scene. Remember, once the crime scene, once we leave it, we can't go back. Those witnesses, if they don't come forward, we don't have them. So once we close down the crime scene, we don't have another opportunity to go back and do some of these things. So remember, safety first. The type of crime that we have obviously is going to dictate the manner in which our safety and everybody involved is going to be at play. Be careful. Remember, the first responders could be there, those fire personnel, emergency medical technicians. They're there to take care of people. Yes, they're contaminating your crime scene, but it's necessary. So just get everybody's name down. We have to eliminate their presence from the crime scene later. Everything that they do, we need to at least explain why were they in our crime scene. At the point that you get there, after the scene is safe, start to ask yourself questions like, if there is a suspect, do I need to broadcast an alarm? Some type of thing over the radio, given a description of what the suspect looks like. For a lot of reasons, this is important, not just because we're trying to capture the person responsible, but because it gives those law enforcement agents in the field that reasonable suspicion to stop somebody that might meet or match the description. This reasonable suspicion, or the idea that, yeah, they look like it, their vehicle looks like it, gives them that authority according to the Fourth Amendment, an exception, and we'll get to that, to stop people. So it's extremely important. After you've broadcast any type of an alarm, then start to decide, putting the tape up. How do I need to keep this crime scene safe? Put up the tape that you've seen all over TV and decide, make it as big as possible. You can always make it smaller later. Once you get the crime scene up, that first officer that was there on the scene, typically the one that was responding to the 911, will help you do that and keep those people that are not supposed to come into the crime scene from coming. And even those within law enforcement know they're not supposed to come into the crime scene. The person that is in control of the crime scene is that first officer responding. Whoever the first officer was that was responding knows that they are in control of that crime scene, not letting anybody into that crime scene till they have been relieved by a detective or a supervisor. At this point, I always like to tell detectives, keep a chronological log. Start writing things down within your notes. The things that you've done. Times are extremely important. Keep a chronological log of everything that's happening. At this point, after you've done the most important things, we start to document. Document what we are seeing. We start by documenting the things that were told to us through dispatch, through the witnesses, the person calling in. The person calling in, we typically call them a PR, person reporting, or an RP, reporting person. It's that person that has vital information. What do they know and what caused them to call us on that particular moment to get all of us there? We start looking at the primary data, things that we saw as we walked in, those observations. This is what I saw when I walked into the crime scene. This is the things that I was told by people. And we start looking for what we call modus operandi, or modes of operation. Things that might be happening that you've seen before. Maybe you haven't. But things that are specific in that crime scene to the crime that we were looking at. What is the suspect doing? Or what has the suspect done? Those specific details of this particular case. We will document in the narrative or the summary of what we're seeing within that crime report. All police departments have crime reports. They vary in many degrees, but most of them will all include, number one, the victim information. We need to have the victim information. In my jurisdiction in Vegas, many of those victims were there traveling. They were there, from other states, from other countries. And if I don't get the contact information from that victim, it becomes extremely difficult to proceed through the courts. We have to prove to the courts that a victim exists. So the victim information is extremely important. Typically cell phones, numbers that we can call to talk to them, addresses, but ways that we can contact. On top of that, I need statements. I need voluntary statements. These victims need to write out what happened to them. What did they see? If they're just a witness but not a victim, we get statements from witnesses and victims outlining everything that they saw in this particular event. Make sure a couple of things. One, that they sign the document. Again, contact information. Have them complete this in blue or black ink. We're going to be copying these statements over and over again. It just makes it easier. We need to document where the location of the crime happened. The location is extremely important. The jurisdiction. Later on, when it gets to the court system, the judges are going to want to know, did this occur within the jurisdiction of my bench, of my courtroom? Extremely important to proceed through courts. We need the times. All the times we suspect that the victim had this happen to him. When did the time that the person calling into dispatch, the time of arrival for everybody, whether it's detectives, the coroner's office, everybody arriving. We need those times. Extremely important. Remember, your name's going to be on this documentation, so make sure that you can write in a legible fashion. Most of what we do anymore is on a laptop, but many times, like the voluntary statements, they will be handwritten. You will then at some point have to decide within your policies that you are working in, the framework, who should I be contacting? My command staff, my immediate supervisor. Make those notifications as necessary. We have in many departments what's called a PIO, or a public information officer. This is somebody that responds to a crime scene that is specially trained to talk to the media. And yes, we talk to the media many times. They assist us in a number of ways, helping us try and track down leads. So that PIO in many times will help us do that. We talked earlier about getting out a description of the suspect. We call this an attempt to locate, or an ATL, the description of the suspect, vehicle, things that might help in giving officers out there something that they can stop, people they can stop, cars they can stop. At this point, as the detective on the scene, you have to decide to start using the things that might help you put the evidence together. Remember, many crimes or many crime scenes, we might not need to call for CSA or CSI, crime scene analysts or crime scene investigators. Unlike what you see on TV, crime scene analysts, they don't really do anything with the suspect as far as interview, interrogation, but they are very, very good at helping us determine what happened in this crime scene, helping us gather the evidence. So they are an analyst in helping us decipher what we are looking at in this crime scene. A little bit different than a forensic scientist. Forensic scientists, remember, those are scientists that answer specific questions that as a detective, investigator that we have, things about the evidence that we collect, and they use their science to go about to try to answer that question. So remember, there's many different types of evidence, and we'll get into them, but at some point you're going to have to determine, do I need CSI there? Many cases don't need CSI. We don't have to have CSI at every crime scene, nor do we need them to prosecute. In most cases, most departments, we will have them come and document almost the majority of our cases, just documenting, but sometimes that might not even be necessary. So every department will have a few things a little bit different depending on your department. In the end of the day, when we go to court and we testify in court, the court looks at two people that we put on the stand as being able to give testimony within the court. The first one, and the majority of people that testify in a courtroom, are called lay witnesses, L-A-Y. Lay witnesses do not give their opinion. They tell us what they personally observed, what they were involved with, things that they were actually doing at the time, and that's why we have them there on the stand. They can't testify about anything other than that, otherwise it becomes hearsay. The other type of witness is what we call an expert witness. Expert witnesses are those that have a specific expertise in the field, and yes, they can give their opinion. So many of our CSI or forensic scientists will be placed on the stand to give an expert witness testimony in the courtroom. So remember, that's extremely important, how we testify in court. In the crime scene, don't overthink it. Most of the time, when we're in there, we're looking for physical changes. You know, with the person that called in, the PR, many times we're just looking at crime scenes to try and say, what's different here today from yesterday? What's been moved? What's been tampered with? Is there anything a little bit different, damaged? Are there things missing? Theft? You know, we are absolutely going to photograph, video, an enormous amount of different ways, whether we use drones, which we are using today many times especially in the outside environment. But there's different types of ways that we document, whether it's cameras and drone photography. And then again, we put up that crime tape. Before we leave, and this is extremely important, everybody always asks, do we need to have a warrant at that crime scene? And the answer is no. The Supreme Court understands that in that moment, we have the right to come in and take care of people. We need to come in and document, and ultimately we need to put a case together. And if there's a suspect that needs to answer to what they did, we do not need to have a warrant. But once we are done with that crime scene, when we're gathering all our stuff, when we decide to leave, if we need to come back at a later date and time, and if the person that owns that property is hostile to our investigation, we might need to get a warrant. So initially, no, but we might need to get one later. So remember, before you leave, get all of those witness statements, make sure they're signed, put that narrative together, the summary in your report, giving all of the things that you were told and that you observed as you exit that crime scene. And then describing in detail the evidence that you have removed and taken from that crime scene, and the process that you are going to be doing to try and answer questions based on that evidence. Don't leave any equipment behind. We try not to leave bags. Certainly we don't want to leave guns. It's happened. But try and gather all of the stuff before you leave. Certainly, you're going to have help on most crime scenes, have detectives and other officers kind of canvassing the neighborhood, looking for those witnesses that might help you in the case. Knocking on doors is extremely important, especially when we don't have any witnesses. We're trying to use the media the best we can. You've seen it all over TV. At some point in our investigation, if we're just at a standstill, we might ask the public, help. We need your help. Does anybody know this person? Has anybody seen this? So we do, in many cases, ask the public for help. 4 things I want you to be thinking about, not necessarily in your reading, but I always like to say, do the best that you can to not ruin, destroy a crime scene by things that afterwards you're like, yeah, I knew better. Number 1, just don't use the bathroom in a crime scene. I get it. We're all human. If you have to go to a neighbor, have somebody watch the crime scene, go elsewhere. Don't use the bathroom within the crime scene. And the same thing with trash receptacles. Don't throw things inside of the trash. Be very, very careful with those types of things. And another big one is we never replace evidence. What I mean by that is if our medical personnel that are in there treating victims, suspects, if they kick a gun, they do things, they move evidence that was in their way when they got there, it stays where they kicked it, where they moved it. We document why it's in this new location, but we never pick things up and try and put them back where we believe to be the original location. For whatever reason, if it's moved, we document why it was moved to that location, by who, and typically for what reason. And then the last one is just be careful holding your humor. In many cases, as you go about your daily business as a detective and investigator, you're going to be doing these on a daily basis. You might not even understand that your demeanor is presenting to the family. Remember, they're in the worst day of their life in many cases. Try not to be laughing about anything that's going on outside, whether it's other police officers, other detectives, because people are watching. And certainly when they're in a state that they're really upset, they don't need to see anybody down the hall in their house laughing, making jokes. It just doesn't give a good picture to any police department, any federal agency. So be very, very careful when you do that. So again, those are things that we typically do when we talk about documenting. Let's talk about evidence now, because evidence really is at the heart of everything that we do in a crime scene. So when we talk about evidence, remember, no evidence is ever going to be allowed into our courtrooms by a judge if it doesn't meet a certain standard of how we gathered that evidence in the crime scene. It has to be admissible in court. We look at a couple of factors. Number one, is it relevant? Relevant means, is there some connection between the fact that we're offering as evidence and the issue we're trying to prove? Is it relevant? The next one is it material. Material evidence is the idea, is it capable of changing somebody's mind on the jury or a judge? Will it influence people? Is it so important, this evidence, that it could change somebody's mind? That becomes material. So we need it to be relevant. We need it to be material. And third, and probably the most contentious, is the idea that evidence must be lawfully obtained according to our Constitution. Remember, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution says that people need to feel safe within their homes, within the place that's their domain. The Fourth Amendment can be extremely complicated, but it means, did we as agents of the government obtain evidence from your house, your car, from you that was unreasonable? We use the term unreasonable. Was it unreasonable in the way that we took it? And if it was, then we might lose that evidence in court. If a judge decides that it was improper, unreasonable, then you might lose the evidence and everything attached to that evidence. So remember, we're trying to look at different things. Two things to consider. We look at expectation of privacy with a microscope. When we have invited guests, and invited guests are in your home, wherever they might be, whether it's in a hotel, a motel, they have those same constitutional rights. Just because they're staying at a hotel or at your house, if they have an expectation of privacy, approach it with the same microscope that we do with everybody else. Remember, the way the courts handle this is they're going to exclude it as evidence, and we won't be able to use that. There are a number of exceptions to the Fourth Amendment. There are times the Supreme Court realizes that, because the Fourth Amendment requires us that if we're going to go somewhere, we need to have probable cause to get permission by a judge to sign a warrant to go into this place looking for evidence. So the only way to get an exception to go into someone's house or their body or anything else, we need to have a warrant that is probable cause, facts and circumstances, not reasonable suspicion. That's just a hunch. So we have probable cause. We present this in an affidavit in front of a magistrate, a judge. If they agree, they give us a warrant, and we're now allowed to go and search for that evidence. On top of that, we have these exceptions. The first exception is this idea of consent. Consent is very simply, people can violate their own Fourth Amendment. As a government agent, if I asked you, hey, can I look in your house? Can I look in your car? I don't have a warrant. I can't threaten you. I can't promise you things. But if I ask you, hey, can I look? And you say yes, you have the right to give me consent to do that. Consent can be verbal. In most cases, we write it down, but it can be verbal. But consent is the number one exception. We have this idea of exigent circumstances. Exigent circumstances is simply there's an emergency going on. An emergency, somebody's screaming, something is happening somewhere, and I hear it happen as a government agent. I can go in without a warrant to try and help people. So that exigent circumstance. Many, many layers of this. We go on a call of a domestic violence. We can do a protective sweep. The Supreme Court understands that we have a dangerous job as government agents. So when we go on these calls, they give us a lot of exceptions to protect ourselves. So exigent circumstances is another one. Search incident to arrest is the idea that we don't want any contraband coming into our jails. So when we arrest somebody, we have the right at that point, once we have a lawful arrest, that we can search people to make sure that nothing gets into our jails that could hurt other inmates or other staff members in that facility. Plain view is just the idea, if I'm in a location that everyone has a right to as a government agent, and I see things that are in plain view, again, I don't necessarily have to have a warrant. It's an exception. Motor vehicles, again, very complicated. Supreme Court has a lot of rules played out. Those are a little bit more complicated that we discuss in upper division classes. I won't really approach that in great detail, but the motor vehicle, because it does move, there are exceptions to that Fourth Amendment. Remember this whole idea of reasonable suspicion comes into play because as law enforcement or government agents, we come in contact with the public in three ways. First way is this consensual encounter. We just stop on the street, we talk to you like, you would expect anyone to do. We talk to you, how you doing? At that point, government agents have no power. We can't force you. We can't get you to do anything. We can't search you. We're just there talking to you. If you don't want to talk to me, you don't have to talk to me. The second layer is reasonable suspicion. This came about in a landmark case. Landmark case meaning very important case that made its way in front of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court made a determination that the way that the government agents, law enforcement will proceed will change. Things changed. So with reasonable suspicion, this landmark case was Terry versus Ohio. The idea with Terry versus Ohio is simply that during the job duties of law enforcement agents, they come into contact with people that are acting strange and suspicious. The Supreme Court says that if law enforcement agents during the capacity of their job find people to be acting strange in a criminal way, this is no excuse by any means to do racial profiling. But if agents of the government believe that someone is acting strange, that it looks like they're trying to commit a crime in any way, we can stop them. Law enforcement can stop them, brief detention based on Terry versus Ohio. During that brief detention, the Supreme Court said we can pat the person down. It's a simple pat down outside of clothing. It is not a search. The intent is patting people down to see if they have a weapon that might hurt the law enforcement agent. So pat them down, looking for a weapon that could hurt them. A brief detention. Typically, this brief detention is about an hour. Certainly, we have to identify ourselves to this person as law enforcement in an appropriate manner. These are the details that reasonable suspicion allows us. After an hour, if we do not have probable cause, that's facts and circumstances, the person will be released. Probable cause is the third layer, where police come into contact. If we have probable cause at this point, an arrest can be made. An arrest will be made for probable cause. So again, these are the three types of things, how we come in contact with the public. With the warrants that we talked about, we'll go into greater detail later. But warrants, once signed by a magistrate, are always about having probable cause that the person that wrote that warrant or the affiant has to outline in this summary or essay to the judge. Again, Fourth Amendment, extremely important, based on is it unreasonable? We lose the evidence or it's suppressed. It can later on be tossed out in a suppression hearing based on everything that we look at. So remember, that's all about the exclusionary rule. The fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine is the idea that if you did do something that was unreasonable, you could lose anything else that's attached to that single moment that you did something that was unreasonable. As an investigator or detective, if you realize that you've made a mistake, back out. Don't stay there. Back out. Make sure you don't violate someone's constitutional rights any further. At this point, we're going to talk about evidence, specific evidence that we see in a crime scene. I want to briefly just mention a few of those things because these are really what we see on TV. Remember, evidence are going to be in the crime scene in many different ways, different categories. We typically divide them into 7 categories. We look at weapons, we look at blood, we look at imprints or impressions, we look at marks or tool marks, things that have left these things at a crime scene. We look at dirt or what we call trace evidence, DNA, hair, things that are very, very small in a crime scene. We look at a lot of documents, a lot of the paperwork that we're looking in many of these residents to determine, one, who lives there, but documents we look at many times, and really just a lot of transfer or very tiny trace evidence. When we talk about weapons, specifically we talk about ballistics. Ballistics basically falls into 2 categories: interior ballistics and exterior ballistics. Interior ballistics are just those types of firearms, the types of guns that we look at, that we typically see in a crime scene. You know, and then we look at the ammunition or what we use within that ballistics trade to determine if it was used, that particular weapon in that crime scene, and was this type of ammunition or what we call a cartridge used in that crime scene. Exterior is the flight of that projectile, the bullet, as it flies through the air. So once it leaves the firearm, what happens? Where does it end at? That's called the exterior ballistics. We look at many different types of things within that realm. Having said that, this is an online course. For those of you that have access to campus, if you're a face-to-face student and you're taking an online course, you're more than welcome, any of you at some point. I teach this class face-to-face. I do many labs on ballistics, on fingerprinting. During the fall and spring semesters when I'm teaching these, you're more than welcome to come in and get a hands-on during that lab time. So just send me an email. If you'd really like to see how this works and get hands-on, send me an email. Blood, the whole idea, I know that there's a TV show out there, Dexter. You know, the whole idea of blood is really about, in many cases, just nothing more than how gravity affects when blood falls from a target to the ground. It can help explain many things within the crime scene, answer a lot of different questions that we might have on top of looking at the ballistics. It's just another element that we look at when we look at different types of evidence in a crime scene. Certainly prints, the types of prints, fingerprints that we look at in a crime scene, extremely important as well. Tool marks, trace evidence, hair, dust, DNA. We do things like looking at glass, all the different fragments of glass onto the ground. We talked about questioned documents. Remember, don't be, as an investigator or detective, all of these types of evidence can hurt you personally. You need to protect yourself. Substance isolation. Try not to get infected by a lot of the things here. Clearly with firearms, be safe. Be safe. These things can hurt you. I shouldn't need to tell you that. But many times you can be infected by a lot of the blood transfer, whether it's HIV, whether it's hepatitis. Again, protect yourself. First line of defense is to wear those gloves and protective gear as we move forward. So having said that, just a couple of things to understand as you read chapters 3, 4, and 5. A lot of good information. The book might be a little, it's hard to keep up with the technology as it moves forward because the drone capabilities are just expanding. So again, what you're reading there might be all kinds of new stuff. It's the basis of how we collect. Remember, keep those in mind when we enter the crime scene. We're doing the best we can. Courts understand that. This whole idea of a crime scene investigator is just to help us understand what we're looking at this moment. If you have any questions, get a hold of me, send me an email. I hope things are well. I'll see you next time.